السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل الفن بأشكاله العديدة هو حركة نشاط ومقاومة بقطع النظر عن المجال الذي نحن فيه. كل منا يقوم بدوره لتغيير المشهد واستعادة الروايات حول تاريخنا والأرض. ولعل ثقافة الطعام باتت اليوم جزءا مهما من هويتنا وكيف نرى ونقدم أنفسنا والأمة. فالاحتلال والتوسع الإسرائيليان يستعران ليس فقط على الساحة السياسية والجغرافيا الميدانية، ولكن أيضا وبقوة على المائدة الفلسطينية وأطباقها المميزة والأصيلة. لذا نلمس اليوم رغبة ومسؤولية من قبل أهل الاختصاص في تصحيح المعلومات الخاطئة والكاذبة والمضللة في الخارج. فالمكون الغذائي العربي الفلسطيني كان مهمشا وغير واضح، ويعاد تفسيره على أنه ينتمي إلى المستوطنين الصهاينة. بعبارة أخرى، ما يسمى ثقافة الطعام الإسرائيلية احتاجت إلى الثقافة العربية الفلسطينية كمصدر للتقليد والتطبيع، ولكن في الوقت عينه رغبت هذه الثقافة الهجينة المغتصبة في تجريد المكون الفلسطيني من هويته، وذلك من باب تهويده، كما هي الحال مع باقي الأمور المتعلقة بفلسطين، حيث وجهتها النهائية كانت سلخ العروبة عنها، وبشكل أكثر تحديدا اقتلاع واجتثاث الفلسطينيين وثقافتهم وتاريخهم وكل ما يمت إليهم من أصالة. ريم قسيس الفلسطينية المقدسية، مؤلفة كتب الطبخ الأكثر مبيعا، المائدة الفلسطينية ومائدة الأرابيسك، والباحثة في علم النفس الاجتماعي والأعمال، تلقي الضوء على ما يحدث في العالم من محاولات حثيثة بائسة خبيثة لسلب هوية الطعام الفلسطيني، وأيضا تشاركنا لتقديم طمأنة إلى الفلسطينيين بأن تاريخهم وقصصهم لا تزال ذات صلة وحيوية، وتنال أخيرا الاعتراف الذي أردناه دائما، ولإلهام الأجيال الشابة الاستمرار في هذا الطريق. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل، معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Reem Qassis, award-winning author of best-selling cookbooks, The Palestinian Table and The Arabesque Table, joining us from Philadelphia. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the Inside, Reem.
Thank you for having me, Zainab.
Pure pleasure to have you always. Well, Reem, art in its countless forms is activism and resistance. We each do our part to change the landscape and reclaim narratives around our histories, as I mentioned in the introduction. Unfortunately, because of the massive divides across geographies, what happens in one part is often or is not often reaching or being recognized in another part of the world, or is being the least distorted, twisted, and falsified. Here, I would appreciate to listen to what is happening in your corner of the world as far as Palestinian food culture appropriation is concerned.
So Zainab, I think the issue of culinary appropriation of Palestinian food is finally now starting to get the recognition it deserves. You know, I remember about 7 or 8 years ago, I was living in London, and you would see these Israeli restaurants popping up left and right. And, you know, I would sometimes walk by or walk in, and you would see they're serving the dishes of our childhood, the things we grew up eating, hummus, falafel, tabbouleh, and nobody even knew that these dishes were Palestinian. And so I felt a sense of responsibility in a way to shed light on this. Now, obviously, the path to get to there was not very straightforward, right? I was working in the business world, I was a consultant at McKinsey, and then I was working in executive search. But when my first daughter was born, and I think you alluded to this in the introduction, I started to notice how dangerous it was that her roots and her culture, the things that had given me a sense of meaning growing up, were starting to disappear and be very hard to hold on to. And I started compiling my family's recipes and stories, initially just as a small project to save for her. But when I saw everything coming together, I thought, you know what? Yes, these are my family's recipes. These are my family's stories. But taken together as a whole, these are the story of any and every Palestinian family. And you look at the narratives that are being shared in the West about Palestinians, and these are definitely not the narratives we were used to hearing. And that's why I wanted to write my first cookbook, as a way to not only reclaim the narrative and show that these foods are Palestinian, but also to show a face of Palestinian people that nobody in the West was bothering to get to know.
How many recipes was the award-winning book, The Palestinian Table, include, and which recipes were the cream of everything?
So the book has over 140 recipes. And I think, we started out with over 200. As you can imagine, the Palestinian kitchen is very rich and diverse, and we had to condense to fit into the book. But the recipes that I like to call the jewels in the crown of Palestinian cooking are the ones in the celebration chapter. So those are the things like maqloube, maftoul, msakhan, mansaf, things that are really very deeply entrenched.
The hardcore.
And yes, exactly.
Yes.
They're the ones that we used to celebrate. They're the ones that really, when you say Palestinian cuisine, you think of those dishes, right? Like hummus is shared, tabbouleh is shared. There's a lot of dishes that are shared across the Levant because we are in a similar geography, and inevitably we will share many of the same dishes. But the really authentic traditional Palestinian dishes are those ones that I mentioned to you now. And they vary by region within Palestine as well, of course.
Just to mention them, just to talk about them, it makes us drool now.
Right.
I will come back to talk about the recipes. But Reem, on some days, like these past weeks during the Israeli outrageous attacks on all Palestine, from the river to the sea,
right.
And when you feel utterly powerless about what is happening at home, you believe that it is a good reminder that you still have some kind of power to resist in different avenues. Reem, let's dig more into the idea of focusing on the work of preserving and disseminating your cultural history as a form of resistance.
So, Zainab, when everything was happening back home these last few weeks, my first sense was a sense of helplessness. I'm here living abroad, and what is it that I can do? And initially, what I felt was, what is the point of talking about food? People are dying. You have entire families being eradicated off the face of the earth by the Israeli aggression. And what am I going to do? Go talk about food on Instagram or in the news? It just felt a little tone deaf. But then I started thinking more, and I thought, this is how systems of oppression work. They want us to lose our motivation, to lose our will, to live, to resist, to continue to spread the narrative. And I thought, even in times of difficulty, in times of atrocity like what is happening now, we still have this responsibility to share our story. And I ended up writing actually a piece about how even amidst what was happening, and Eid al-Fitr happened during the
Sure.
time of aggression, you still saw pictures in Gaza of women making ka'ak or ma'moul, making summa'iyya, making a lot of dishes that to them signified we are still alive. We are resisting simply by existing here. And I wanted to capture that here in the West to show that we shouldn't have to always be resilient, right? We shouldn't have to be living in the circumstances that we live under back home. But even amidst it all, the Palestinian spirit doesn't break. And that was something that I wanted to show the West here, and we showed it through food.
Sure. Some might ask, Reem, well, it's food. Who owns anything when it comes to food? What's the limit of cultural appropriation? Reem, how do you, through your food writing activism, attempt to offer assurance to the Palestinians that your history, it's our history too, and the stories are still relevant and finally getting the recognition they've always wanted, and also to inspire younger generations to continue on this path?
So it's a very important question, Zaina, that you raise, and I address this in my new book, which, you're saying food has been throughout history, it's a story of diffusion, right? And the Islamic and the Arab Empire, they traveled across the world, they forged empires, they learned from other cultures. So we start to think, well, what is the statute of limitations and who owns what? And I think the very important distinction to point out is the difference between culinary diffusion and culinary appropriation. Diffusion is when you have people, either by living side by side, through trade, through travel, through any kind of means of information exchange, learning from and adapting each other's foods. That happens throughout history. Appropriation is very different. Appropriation is when you take the foods of a certain culture and you willfully deny the origins of that food.
Like what happened with the hummus.
Exactly. You know, it's denying that the Jews that came to Palestine, they came long before 1948. And they were, you know, they lived peacefully side by side initially, and they learned a lot of dishes from the indigenous population. The problem is when the Zionist enterprise, you start to want to have a separate entity, social, political, economic, etc., and then you willfully want to ignore where you learned those dishes from. You want to build a different narrative about where they came. You know, people will tell you, well, Arab Jews brought it with them, but that's not true. I mean, Arab Jews mostly came from Iraq and Iran and Egypt, not places where hummus is even common. And that's just a very small example, but it's just to hammer point the point that appropriation is denying the origin.
So if it's not hummus,
is learning.
Sure, it's hummus and the falafel and, you know, all those dishes that are very much peculiar to specific areas in the Levant. That's very true.
I think the very important thing to know is also our history. Right. And I've always tried, especially with this new book, to hammer this point. We cannot get into these conversations. We cannot get into these arguments if we do not understand our very rich past. And that is a responsibility on us as a young generation of Palestinians to understand not just what we eat today and not just to argue over hummus is mine, hummus is yours, but to understand the trajectory of these foods. And we can, in very small ways, continue to instill this narrative in younger generations, whether it's through the foods we cook at home, through the stories that we tell, through the work that we do. We all have this responsibility to share this narrative. And I do it through food. There are other people doing it through art, through embroidery, through music, through literature. And I think when we all come together, this collective effort at safeguarding our heritage and our culture is in and of itself an act of resistance against our erasure from history.
Yes, right. Reem, allow us to stop now for a short break, and then afterwards we're going to dig more into the relationship between food and identity, but after the break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. ريم قسيس, award-winning author of best-selling cookbooks, The Palestinian Table and The Arabesque Table. Welcome back to من الداخل from the inside, Reem. Well,
thank you.
As a scholar in social psychology, which you have molded into your expertise in food writing, you believe that our choice of focusing on food, culture, and national identity stems from an anthropological truism that how we eat, what we eat, and what we choose not to eat communicates who we are to ourselves and others. Reem, might you highlight more the relationship between food and identity, please? Sure.
So identity can be based on a lot of things, and food is one of the ways around which you see countries start to build a national identity. I mean, the concept of national cuisine is a relatively recent construct that came about with the rise of the nation state in the 18th and 19th century. Food itself is a regional artifact. Even within Palestine, within Lebanon, Syria, you notice regional differences between the foods. So what happens is you start to see in places, for example, you see Thailand. They start in the 1930s to galvanize nationalism around pad thai. Israel did the same exact thing. They wanted to build a state, and in order to build this state and build a collective sense of identity, there was no Israel in Palestine before the Zionist enterprise wanted to create this country. Food was an easy way around which to bring people together collectively. So it's interesting when you take a step back and you see it's part of a much bigger concerted effort at building an identity that everyone can relate to. But Zainab, you also see that there are a lot of Jewish Arabs who disagree with Arab Jews who disagree with this. For example, the Jews in Tunisia will tell you, well, we were eating shakshuka long before Israel was a state. So now you want to include shakshuka in the Jewish cuisine by way of Israel. Why are you denying our very own past and culture as Arab Jews?
Right, right.
So it's, it's insulting on multiple fronts, if you will.
Sure, that's very true. Now, since the release of your first cookbook, The Palestinian Table, Palestinian cuisine has gained more popularity in the West, and you talked about that, and it has become a mainstream recognized cuisine, leading to massive shifts in perception and recognition. In addition, with the articles that you have written, leading American outlets, media outlets of course, have for the first time ever given a platform to share the Palestinian narrative with such a wide audience. What does that mean, Reem?
To me, that is a very big win, because as Palestinians, one of the only tools that we have is to tell our story to the world. Our hope is that you can shift public opinion, you can get support from the outside world for our plight, and to be able to see, leading American news publications allowing articles that previously would not have, even the mention of the word Palestine or Palestinian still triggers a lot of backlash and a lot of, criticisms in the media, but still you're able to see major radio stations, major newspapers allowing these articles to be written about culinary appropriation, about the Palestinian experience. To me, that is a win, right? It is not, it's a small step towards a much bigger one, which is eventually getting Palestinians justice and freedom. But it's, at least to me, it's validating. It tells me that the work that we're doing, even if it feels difficult, even if at times it feels like it's not going anywhere, in hindsight, when you start to combine all those small steps together, you realize they do affect a bigger change.
And how are they interacting with your scrumptious delicacies and recipes?
So they've been very positively accepted here. I have people from across all walks of lives, across all religions and ethnicities who are very much loving the food.
Right. Your most recent cookbook, The Arabesque Table, took a wider lens than the first, and in portraying a modern Arab table, traced the history and origins of our dishes to the earliest cookbooks on record, showcasing just how influential Arab cuisine has been on the cuisine of the whole world. How intertwined and cross-cultural cuisine is, even as it remains crucial to defining our national identities, Reem.
So I wanted to write this book because there's a lot of books that come out and will call themselves anything, Palestinian, Lebanese, etc., and the dishes are fusion. And that kind of defeats the purpose of what we try to do when we try to safeguard the very traditional national dishes that we have. And so it's true that the way we eat is changing. It is true that, with modernization, with travel and the exchange of information, these dishes do get changed, or they evolve over time. But it is so important to also know the history. And the history is fascinating because a lot of the arguments sometimes you hear, when people want to fight back on the issue of appropriation, they will say to you, well, you Arabs, you took a lot of food from the Ottomans. But that's actually not true, because the very first Ottoman cookbook was nothing more than a translation of a medieval Arabic cookbook. And you start to learn these things. The bagel, which is very much associated with Jewish cuisine here in the West, actually has its origin in a 13th century Arabic medieval cookbook. It's called ka'ik. And so to me, it was very important to, so you trace the history and suddenly you are armed with real knowledge about how influential Arab cuisine has been. A lot of desserts you see in the West in Italian restaurants, panna cotta, blancmange, all these desserts, it was Arabs who introduced the thickening of milk with starch to Europe during the Middle Ages. And it's very nice to be able to actually know this history.
Knowledge is power.
Understand.
Knowledge is power.
It is indeed.
Yes, Reem.
It's also good to see how Arabs diffused this knowledge, and it wasn't, unlike the situation with Israel right now, it's not about appropriation. It's about learning and sharing the knowledge. It's not about taking and denying.
Sure. When it comes to the issue of culinary appropriation, how aggressive and dangerous might that be? I mean, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs themselves perpetuate this with broad daylight theft of dishes. However, we are starting to see very slowly and very subtly some on the inside refuting this and calling out the theft and ethnic cleansing for what it is. Reem, why do the Palestinians object to the term Israeli food?
Because, Zainab, the term Israeli cuisine in and of itself is trying to erase us from history. It is not a problem, the issue, I always say, it is not about Israelis eating hummus. It is not about Israelis eating falafel or even selling those foods. It's about the willful denying of where these foods have come from. It's about the desire to erase any existence of Palestinians from the history so that they can perpetuate this narrative of a land without a people for a people without a land. And it's very dangerous when you try to erase an entire population. And I think the only thing right now that gives me hope is to see that younger generations are still refused. You know, they used to say the old will die and the young will forget, but we have not forgotten. We are fighting to preserve our heritage, and it is dangerous if we forget.
And
it is dangerous if this appropriation continues.
Reem, the recent developments and confrontations, it has shown very clearly, loud and clear, that no, they do not forget. And here I would like to ask you my last question is that what do you say, Reem, vis-a-vis the recent developments and confrontations when it comes to whatever is happening in occupied Al-Quds and also 1948 Palestine, occupied Palestine, in the West Bank, in Gaza, and this heroic confrontation and defeat of the Israelis, and also in the recent repugnant march of flags that has taken place, with also the many statements that were said, and also the confrontations in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood recently?
I think the first thing I would say is that you mentioned the difference. You said Sheikh Jarrah, Gaza, 1948, and I think the one thing I want to say is we're all Palestinians, regardless of where we are in the country, regardless of where we are outside. We are all fighting for the same things. And I think right now, seeing this aggression, seeing it so broadly, so publicly everywhere in the world, it is finally starting to shift public opinion. We have a long way to go still. But I think it's important now because I look at my own kids, Zainab, who are 5 and 7, and you can't hide these things from them. Sure. You know, they see what is happening, and these things will instill in a younger generation the desire to again and again continue on this mission of preserving, but also of fighting back. You know, we each do it in our own way. And yes, I'm doing it by preserving food, but at the end of the day, we are fighting back against our erasure, against our occupation and our oppression. But the important thing to remember through all this is us Palestinians, regardless of where we are in the country or outside, we are one people on the same mission.
Sure. Until Palestine, all Palestine is liberated from the river to the sea, this Israeli enemy food appropriation will not stop. Only through resistance, activism, education, and bringing out the facts, as you said, Reem, this will stop it. Reem Qassis, award-winning author of best-selling cookbooks, The Palestinian Table and The Arabesque Table. Thank you very much for sharing your valuable insights, Reem.
Thank you for having me, Zainab. It was a real pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you. Always a pleasure. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.